Marcus Thompson limped through the automatic doors of the downtown cafe, his prosthetic leg clicking against the polished floor with each careful step. The familiar sound drew glances from other customers, some sympathetic, others curious, and a few that carried the weight of judgment he had grown accustomed to over the past 2 years. The morning rush was in full swing at Cornerstone Café, a popular spot frequented by business professionals, college students, and local residents. The aroma of freshly ground coffee beans mixed with the sweet scent of pastries, creating an atmosphere of comfortable normalcy that Marcus both craved and found challenging to navigate. He approached the counter where Sarah, a young barista with bright pink streaks in her hair, greeted him with a genuine smile. She had served him countless times over the past 6 months, never asking about his obvious disability, never treating him differently than any other customer. This simple act of normalcy meant more to Marcus than she could ever know. "The usual Marcus?" Sarah asked, already reaching for a large cup. "Please," he replied, grateful for the routine. "Large black coffee, extra hot." As Sarah prepared his order, Marcus heard familiar voices behind him. 3 men in expensive suits had claimed a corner table near the large windows overlooking the busy street. Their conversation carried easily across the relatively quiet cafe, and Marcus recognized the voices immediately. They worked in the same downtown office building where he had recently started his new job as an IT consultant. David Hoffman, the loudest of the 3, was known throughout their building for his controversial opinions and his tendency to voice them without consideration for whom might be listening. His companions, Robert Chun and Michael Stevens, often served as his audience, occasionally challenging his views, but more often simply nodding along to avoid confrontation. "I'm telling you," David continued, his voice growing louder as he warmed to his topic, "these veterans come back expecting special treatment everywhere they go. Free this, discount that, preferred parking spots. It's getting ridiculous." Marcus felt his shoulders tense as he waited for his coffee. He had heard variations of this conversation before in different places from different people. The assumption that veterans who had been wounded in service were somehow taking advantage of the system, seeking handouts or special privileges they hadn't earned. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't know, David. I mean, they did serve their country. Some of them went through pretty terrible experiences." "Oh, please," David scoffed, taking a large sip of his latte. "Half of them probably never saw real combat anyway. They're just milking the system for everything they can get. And the ones who did see action, well, they knew what they were signing up for when they enlisted." Michael nodded slowly, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "But what about the guys who got injured? I mean, losing a limb or getting PTSD, that's got to be pretty rough." David leaned back in his chair, a smug expression crossing his face. "Look, I'm not saying it's easy, but they made their choice. Nobody forced them to join the military. They wanted the adventure, the excitement, the chance to play hero. Well, sometimes heroes get hurt. That's the risk they took." Sarah handed Marcus his coffee, and he noticed her troubled expression. She had obviously been listening to the conversation as well, and her usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by obvious discomfort. "Some people," she muttered quietly, shaking her head as she wiped down the counter. Marcus took his coffee and moved toward the condiment station, positioned unfortunately close to where the 3 men continued their discussion. He tried to focus on adding sugar to his drink, but their voices made it impossible to ignore their words. "The thing that really gets me," David continued, his voice rising with conviction, "is how they expect everyone to treat them like heroes just because they wore a uniform. I pay my taxes, I contribute to society, I work hard every day. But do I get thanked for my service? Do I get special discounts and preferred treatment? Of course not. That's a bit different though, isn't it?" Robert attempted to interject. "I mean, they were willing to die for the country." David laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the morning chatter of the cafe. "Willing to die? Most of them never came close to dying. They probably spent their deployments sitting in air-conditioned offices or playing video games on base. The whole warrior thing is just marketing to make people feel sorry for them." Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he stirred his coffee, memories threatening to surface despite his efforts to push them down. The sound of helicopters, the smell of burning fuel, the screams of his fellow soldiers as their convoy came under attack. The moment when the improvised explosive device detonated beneath their vehicle, forever changing the trajectory of his life and ending the lives of two men he had considered brothers. And another thing, David pressed on, seemingly oblivious to the effect his words might be having on others in the cafe. A lot of these guys come back claiming they have PTSD or anxiety or whatever, but they're really just looking for an excuse not to work. They want to collect disability payments and sit around feeling sorry for themselves instead of getting on with their lives. Michael glanced around the cafe, nervously, perhaps beginning to realize that their conversation might not be appropriate for such a public setting. Maybe we should keep our voices down a bit, David. But David was too caught up in his rant to pay attention to his friend's suggestion. Why should I keep my voice down? I'm entitled to my opinion. And my opinion is that too many of these veterans are professional victims who use their service as an excuse for their failures in life. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, fighting the urge to turn around and confront the man whose ignorant words were cutting deeply into old wounds. He thought about his therapist's advice about choosing his battles, about not letting other people's ignorance define his worth or drag him into unnecessary conflicts. The worst ones are the amputees, David continued, apparently determined to share every offensive thought that crossed his mind. They parade around with their missing limbs like badges of honor, expecting everyone to feel sorry for them. But honestly, if you're stupid enough to get yourself blown up in some pointless war, that's on you. Natural selection at work. The cafe seemed to grow quieter around them, other customers beginning to notice the increasingly inappropriate conversation. Sarah looked toward the manager's office, clearly considering whether to intervene, while several other patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Robert and Michael exchanged worried glances, finally beginning to understand that their friend had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed, especially not in such a public forum. Marcus felt his heart racing, his breathing becoming shallow as David's words triggered responses he had spent months learning to control through therapy. The rational part of his mind knew that engaging with someone so willfully ignorant would likely accomplish nothing positive, but the emotional part of him burned with anger and hurt. He turned slightly, catching sight of the three men for the first time since their conversation began. David was exactly what Marcus had expected, a soft, pale man in his 40s who had clearly never faced a day of real hardship in his privileged life. His expensive suit, perfect haircut, and manicured nails spoke of someone who had always had things handed to him, someone who had never been forced to make the kind of sacrifices that build real character. As Marcus watched, David continued his tirade, his voice growing louder and more animated with each passing moment. It was clear that the man was enjoying his audience, feeding off what he perceived as agreement from his companions, completely oblivious to the discomfort he was causing throughout the cafe. I mean, seriously, David said, gesturing broadly with his coffee cup. If these guys were really as tough as they pretend to be, they'd handle their problems without whining to everyone about them. But instead, they want sympathy and special treatment for the rest of their lives. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of walking away, instead of choosing the path of least resistance that his therapist had recommended, he turned around and approached the table where the three men sat. The conversation stopped abruptly as Marcus's shadow fell across their table, his imposing 6-foot frame and broad shoulders creating an unmistakable presence. Up close, the slight tremor in his hands was visible, along with the careful way he distributed his weight to accommodate his prosthetic leg. "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." David looked up at Marcus with a mixture of surprise and annoyance, clearly not appreciating the interruption to his monologue. His eyes quickly took in Marcus's appearance, lingering for a moment on the obvious signs of his military service and disability, but showing no recognition of the connection between his words and the man standing before him. "Can we help you with something?" David asked, his tone dismissive and slightly aggressive. "This is a private conversation." Marcus remained calm, his years of military training helping him maintain composure even as his heart pounded in his chest. "Actually, I think your conversation stopped being private when you decided to share your opinions about veterans loud enough for the entire cafe to hear." Robert and Michael shifted uncomfortably, both beginning to understand that they were about to witness something significant. Other customers had begun to pay attention as well, conversations at nearby tables growing quieter as people sensed the tension building in the corner of the cafe. David, however, seemed oblivious to the changing atmosphere. If anything, he appeared energized by the confrontation, as if he finally had the opportunity to share his views with someone who might actually challenge them. "Oh, so you're one of those guys who gets offended every time someone speaks honestly about the military," David said, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression. "Let me guess, you're probably a veteran yourself, right? Feeling all hurt because someone dared to question the sacred narrative about your service." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, I'm a veteran. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne Division." His voice remained level, but there was an underlying intensity that made David's companions increasingly uncomfortable. "Well, there you go," David said, spreading his hands as if he had proven some important point. "Of course you're going to defend the system that benefits you. But that doesn't change the fact that too many veterans use their service as a crutch instead of taking responsibility for their own lives." Sarah watched from behind the counter, her hand hovering near the phone as she debated whether to call her manager or security. The entire cafe had grown noticeably quieter, with customers at nearby tables abandoning any pretense of not listening to the unfolding confrontation. Marcus pulled out the empty chair at their table and sat down, his movement deliberate and controlled. The action caught all 3 men off guard, particularly David, who had expected the veteran to either walk away in anger or explode in rage. Instead, Marcus appeared completely calm, almost serene. "I'd like to tell you about my last deployment," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite its low volume. "About the day that changed my perspective on a lot of things." David opened his mouth to object, but something in Marcus's demeanor made him hesitate. There was a quality in the veteran's eyes that suggested this was not a man to be dismissed lightly, a depth of experience that commanded attention even from someone as arrogant as David. "We were escorting a convoy of supplies to a forward operating base in the Khyber province," Marcus began, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond David's shoulder as the memories came flooding back. "It was supposed to be a routine mission. We'd done the same run dozens of times before without incident." Michael and Robert listened intently, while David maintained his skeptical expression but remained uncharacteristically quiet. Around them, the normal sounds of the cafe seemed to fade into the background as Marcus's words painted a picture of a world far removed from their comfortable, suburban reality. The convoy consisted of 4 vehicles. I was the gunner in the second Humvee, responsible for watching our flanks and providing cover if we encountered enemy forces. My best friend, Tommy Rodriguez, was driving our vehicle. Behind me sat Jake Morrison, a medic from Ohio who had joined our unit just 3 months earlier. Marcus paused, taking a sip of his coffee as he gathered his thoughts. The simple act seemed to ground him, providing an anchor to the present moment as he prepared to revisit one of the most traumatic experiences of his life. "Tommy and I had been friends since basic training," he continued. "We were both from small towns, both had joined the Army right out of high school, both dreamed of going to college when we got back. Jake was different, though. He was older, maybe 25, and he'd actually been in college, studying to be a teacher before he decided to enlist after September 11th. David shifted impatiently in his seat, clearly wanting to interrupt, but something about the growing attention from other customers kept him silent. He was beginning to realize that his earlier comments might have been overheard by more people than he had initially thought. The IED was buried in the road about 15 miles from our destination, Marcus said, his voice remaining steady despite the emotional weight of his words. The insurgents had disguised it perfectly, hidden it beneath what looked like normal road debris. Our lead vehicle passed right over it without triggering the device. He paused again, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if drawing warmth from it. But when our Humvee reached that spot, the weight distribution was different. The device detonated directly beneath Tommy's seat. The cafe had grown completely silent now, with even the staff behind the counter stopping their work to listen. Sarah stood motionless, a dish rag forgotten in her hands, as Marcus continued his story. The explosion lifted our vehicle completely off the ground and flipped it onto its side. I was thrown clear, which probably saved my life, but my left leg was nearly severed by shrapnel. Tommy wasn't as lucky. The blast killed him instantly. David's face had gone pale, his earlier bravado beginning to crumble as the reality of Marcus's experience became clear. But Marcus wasn't finished. Jake survived the initial blast, but he was trapped in the wreckage with severe internal injuries. I could hear him calling for help, could see him trying to reach his medical kit, even though he was bleeding internally. The enemy forces that had planted the IED were still in the area, and we started taking small arms fire while the rest of the convoy tried to mount a rescue operation. Marcus looked directly at David for the first time since he had begun his story. I want you to understand what happened next, because it relates to something you said earlier about veterans using their service as an excuse for their failures. The other man seemed to shrink back in his chair, no longer the confident voice of authority he had been just minutes before. His companions, Robert and Michael, looked as though they wanted to disappear entirely. Despite my injuries, despite the fact that I was losing blood rapidly and going into shock, I crawled back to that overturned Humvee. Not because I was particularly brave or heroic, but because Jake was my responsibility. He was part of my team, part of my family. In that moment, my own pain, my own safety, none of that mattered. Marcus's voice grew quieter, forcing everyone in the cafe to strain to hear his words. I managed to pull Jake from the wreckage, but he died in my arms while we waited for the medical evacuation helicopter to arrive. His last words were about his sister back home, about how he'd promised to be at her wedding the following spring. The silence in the cafe was complete now, broken only by the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. David stared down at his hands, no longer able to meet Marcus's steady gaze. I spent the next 8 months in military hospitals, undergoing 17 different surgeries to save what was left of my leg. When it became clear that amputation was the only option, I chose to have it done so I could get on with my life. Not because I was looking for sympathy or special treatment, but because I wanted to honor the memory of the men who didn't come home. Marcus stood up slowly, his prosthetic leg clicking softly against the floor. You said earlier that veterans like me should have died over there. You suggested that we're somehow defective because we survived when others didn't, that we use our service as an excuse for our failures in life. David finally looked up, his face flushed with shame and embarrassment. Around them, other customers watched in complete silence, many with tears in their eyes as they absorbed the weight of Marcus's story. I want you to know, Marcus said, his voice still calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel, that I think about Tommy and Jake every single day. I think about their families, about the futures they'll never have, about the children they'll never raise, and the dreams they'll never fulfill. And I try to live my life in a way that honors their sacrifice. He picked up his coffee cup and took a step back from the table. I don't want your sympathy, and I don't need your approval. But I do expect your respect, not because of what happened to me, but because of what happened to them. And if you can't find it in yourself to show that respect, then at least have the decency to keep your ignorant opinions to yourself. The confrontation seemed to be reaching its conclusion, but Marcus wasn't quite finished. He had one more point to make, one more truth that needed to be shared before he could walk away from this encounter. You want to know what real failure looks like? He asked, his gaze never leaving David's face. Real failure is sitting in comfort and safety, enjoying freedoms that other people died to protect, and using that privilege to mock and belittle the people who made those freedoms possible. With that, Marcus turned and began walking toward the exit, his measured steps echoing in the silent cafe. But Before he could reach the door, something happened that no one could have predicted. David suddenly pushed back from the table and stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face was flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger, and his hands were shaking slightly as he pointed an accusing finger at Marcus's retreating figure. "You think you're so special, don't you?" David called out, his voice cracking with emotion. "You think that story gives you the right to lecture me about respect? Well, I've got news for you, hero. You should have died over there with your buddies instead of coming back here to milk the system and make everyone else feel guilty about your poor life choices." The words hung in the air like a physical blow, and every person in the cafe seemed to stop breathing simultaneously. Marcus froze in place, his back still turned to David, while shocked gasps rippled through the crowd of customers and staff. Sarah dropped the dish rag she had been holding, her mouth falling open in disbelief. Even Robert and Michael looked horrified, clearly understanding that their companion had crossed a line so far beyond acceptable behavior that there could be no excuse or explanation for his words. Marcus slowly turned around, and for the first time since the conversation began, his carefully maintained composure showed signs of cracking. His jaw was clenched tight, and his hands had formed into fists at his sides. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as everyone waited to see how he would respond to such a vicious attack. But before Marcus could say anything, David continued his assault, apparently believing that his words had given him some kind of advantage. "That's right, I said it. You and all the other professional victims like you should have stayed over there in the sand where you belong. At least then, you wouldn't be here taking jobs and benefits away from real Americans who actually contribute to society." The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of someone's coffee cup settling into its saucer seemed as loud as a gunshot. Marcus stood perfectly still, processing the magnitude of what had just been said to him, while around the cafe, other customers began to react with visible anger and disgust. An older man at a nearby table slowly stood up, his weathered hands gripping the back of his chair. He appeared to be in his 70s, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested military service in his own past. "Son," he said to David in a voice that carried the authority of someone who had seen real combat, "I think you need to apologize right now, and then leave this establishment before you say something you'll regret even more." A younger woman at another table had pulled out her phone and appeared to be recording the incident, while several other customers had begun murmuring angrily among themselves. The manager of the cafe, a middle-aged woman named Linda, emerged from her office with a look of barely controlled fury on her face. But David seemed oblivious to the storm he had created around himself. If anything, the attention appeared to embolden him further. "Oh, what? Now everyone's going to gang up on me for speaking the truth. I'm not apologizing for stating facts. This guy and people like him are a drain on our society, and somebody needed to say it." Marcus finally found his voice, though when he spoke, his words were so quiet that everyone in the cafe had a strain to hear them. "My name is Marcus Thompson, Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson, 82nd Airborne Division, United States Army. I served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, and I was awarded the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star with Valor, and the Combat Infantry Badge." He took a step closer to David, his artificial leg clicking against the floor with each measured movement. Tommy Rodriguez was 19 years old when he died. He was from a small town in Texas, and he joined the Army to pay for college so he could become a teacher like his father. Jake Morrison was 25, from Ohio. He left behind a fiancée and a 6-year-old daughter from a previous relationship. David opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus continued speaking, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I came back from that deployment with 17 pieces of shrapnel still embedded in my body, chronic pain that will never go away, and psychological scars that took 2 years of intensive therapy to begin healing. But I also came back with something else." The entire cafe was hanging on his every word, and even David seemed to realize that he was about to hear something significant. I came back with the absolute certainty that every day I have on this earth is a gift that Tommy and Jake will never receive. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let some ignorant coward who's never faced a moment of real adversity in his entire privileged life tell me that I should have died with them. Marcus was now close enough to David that he could see the sweat beading on the other man's forehead. You want to know what I do for a living? I work as an IT consultant for a major corporation downtown. I pay my taxes, I volunteer at a homeless shelter on weekends, and I mentor other veterans who are struggling to readjust to civilian life. What exactly is it that I'm taking away from you? David tried to back away, but he was trapped between Marcus and the wall of the cafe. His earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing awareness that he had made a terrible mistake and that there might be serious consequences for his words. I was just saying that, David stammered, but Marcus cut him off. You were saying that I should be dead, that my friend should be dead, that the men and women who volunteer to put their lives at risk for this country are somehow less deserving of life than people like you who have never sacrificed anything for anyone. The older veteran who had spoken earlier approached the confrontation, his own anger evident in his rigid posture. I served in Vietnam, he said to David, and I've heard ignorant comments like yours before, but I've never heard anyone have the audacity to tell a wounded veteran to his face that he should have died in combat. A woman at another table stood up, tears streaming down her face. My son is deployed in Iraq right now, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. How dare you say such things about the people who are risking their lives to protect us? The crowd in the cafe was growing increasingly hostile toward David, and it was becoming clear that his position was becoming untenable. Robert and Michael had distanced themselves from their companion, both looking as though they wanted to disappear into the floor. Linda, the cafe manager, stepped forward with a look of absolute determination on her face. Sir, she said to David, I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately. Your behavior is completely unacceptable, and you're no longer welcome in this establishment. But David, perhaps realizing that his reputation and possibly his career were in serious jeopardy, made one final attempt to salvage the situation. Look, maybe I got a little carried away, but this guy started it by butting into our private conversation. All I was doing was expressing my opinion about government spending on veterans' benefits. Marcus shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment crossing his face. No, you weren't talking about government spending. You were talking about people. Real people with real experiences and real sacrifices. You were reducing the most defining moments of our lives to some kind of political talking point. The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, and it became apparent that someone had called the police to report the disturbance. David's face went white as he realized the potential ramifications of the situation. And, just so we're clear, Marcus continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent cafe. I don't want your apology. An apology would imply that you understand what you did wrong, and I don't think you're capable of that level of self-awareness. As the sirens grew closer, David made a desperate attempt to leave the cafe, but found his path blocked by several customers who had positioned themselves near the exit. The young woman who had been recording the incident spoke up for the first time. I've uploaded this entire conversation to social media, she announced, holding up her phone. I think people should know what kind of person would say such things to a veteran who was wounded serving our country. David's face went from white to green as the full implications of his situation became clear. In the age of social media and viral videos, his words would likely be seen by thousands, possibly millions, of people within a matter of hours. But the consequences of his actions were about to become even more severe than he could have imagined. As Marcus stood there, processing everything that had just occurred, something began happening outside the cafe that would change everything for everyone present. The sound of screeching brakes and shouting voices filtered through the large windows, followed by what sounded like running footsteps on the sidewalk. Several customers turned to look outside, their expressions changing from curiosity to alarm as they saw what was happening on the street. Through the large windows of the cafe, Everyone could see a scene of chaos unfolding on the busy downtown street. A young man in dark clothing was running frantically down the sidewalk, clutching what appeared to be a woman's purse while shouting angrily at someone behind him. About 50 feet back, an elderly woman was on her knees on the concrete, blood visible on her hands and face where she had fallen during the robbery. The purse snatcher was heading directly toward the cafe, and it quickly became apparent that he intended to use the crowded building as either an escape route or a place to hide from the police who were undoubtedly pursuing him. Several customers began backing away from the windows as the man approached, his desperate expression and erratic movements suggesting that he might be under the influence of drugs. Marcus was the first to react to the developing situation. His military training kicked in immediately, overriding the emotional turmoil of his confrontation with David as his mind shifted into tactical mode. He quickly assessed the layout of the cafe, noting the positions of customers, potential escape routes, and anything that could be used as cover or as a weapon if necessary. "Everyone get away from the front entrance," Marcus called out in a voice that carried unmistakable authority. "Move toward the back of the cafe, behind the counter, if possible." Linda, the manager, immediately began herding customers toward the rear of the building while Sarah ran to call 911. The elderly veteran who had supported Marcus earlier helped guide several confused patrons to safety, his own military experience evident in his calm efficiency under pressure. David, meanwhile, seemed paralyzed by the rapidly developing crisis. The man who had been so vocal about veterans being cowards and failures was now cowering behind an overturned table, his face pale with terror as the reality of actual danger confronted him for perhaps the first time in his comfortable life. The purse snatcher reached the cafe entrance and burst through the glass doors, immediately scanning the interior for police or anyone who might try to stop him. He was clearly agitated, possibly high on methamphetamine or another stimulant, and his eyes had the wild, unfocused look of someone who was not entirely rational. "Nobody move," he shouted, pulling what appeared to be a knife from his jacket pocket. "I just need to get through here, and nobody has to get hurt." Marcus positioned himself between the armed man and the cluster of customers who were taking shelter behind the counter. His prosthetic leg put him at a disadvantage in terms of mobility, but his training and experience in dealing with dangerous situations gave him a significant advantage in terms of tactical thinking. "Take it easy," Marcus said calmly, raising his hands to show that he wasn't armed. "Nobody here wants any trouble. If you just want to pass through, that's fine. No one's going to try to stop you." The robber looked at Marcus suspiciously, clearly trying to determine whether the veteran posed a threat. "You some kind of cop?" he demanded, waving the knife in Marcus's direction. "No," Marcus replied, his voice remaining steady despite the proximity of the weapon. "Just a customer who doesn't want anyone to get hurt." Behind the counter, David watched in fascination and growing horror as the man he had just finished calling a coward and a failure calmly faced down an armed criminal. The contrast between Marcus's composed bravery and his own paralyzing fear was becoming impossible to ignore. The purse snatcher took several steps deeper into the cafe, his head swiveling back and forth as he searched for another exit. "There's got to be a back door somewhere," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "I can't go back out there. The cops are everywhere." "The back exit is through the kitchen," Linda called out from behind the counter, her voice shaking but audible. "Just go straight back and turn left." But as the robber began moving toward the rear of the cafe, something went wrong. Whether due to his drug-induced paranoia or simply the stress of the situation, he suddenly spun around and grabbed Sarah, the young barista, pulling her against him with a knife pressed to her throat. "Actually, I think I'm going to need some insurance," he snarled, his grip tightening on the terrified young woman. "Everyone just stay back, and nobody follows me when I leave." Sarah whimpered in terror, her eyes wide with fear as the blade pressed against her neck. The other customers gasped in horror, several of them beginning to cry as the situation escalated far beyond a simple robbery. Marcus felt his heart rate spike, but his voice remained calm as he addressed the increasingly unstable criminal. "You don't need to do that. Nobody here is going to follow you. Just let her go, and take whatever you want from the register." "Shut up," the robber screamed, his control clearly slipping. "I'm making the decisions here, not you." It was at that moment that Marcus made a choice that would define not only his own character, but also the character of everyone else in that cafe. Despite his disability, despite the tactical disadvantage of his prosthetic leg, despite the very real possibility that his intervention could result in serious injury or death for both himself and Sarah, he began moving slowly toward the armed man. "Look," Marcus said, taking a careful step forward, "you're scared and you're trying to get out of a bad situation. I understand that. But hurting innocent people isn't going to solve your problems. It's only going to make them worse." The robber's eyes darted between Marcus and the rear exit, clearly torn between his desire to escape and his growing panic about the approaching police sirens. "I said stay back. I'll cut her throat. I swear I will." Marcus took another step forward, his hand still raised, but his posture subtly shifting into a more tactical stance. "I believe you would, and that's why I'm asking you not to. This young woman has never done anything to hurt you. She's just trying to make a living, just like you probably are." Behind the counter, David watched in amazement as Marcus continued his slow approach toward the armed robber. The veteran's disability, which David had mocked just minutes before, was clearly a significant handicap in this situation. Yet Marcus pressed forward anyway, putting himself at risk to protect someone he barely knew. "My name is Marcus," the veteran continued, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone despite the deadly seriousness of the situation. "I'm a veteran, and I've been in situations like this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough to understand that everyone here just wants to go home safely tonight." Sarah's eyes were fixed on Marcus's face, drawing strength from his calm demeanor, even as the knife remained pressed against her throat. Around the cafe, other customers watched in tense silence as the drama played out before them. "I've seen what happens when people make decisions based on fear and panic," Marcus said, now only about 10 feet away from the robber and his hostage. "And I've seen what happens when people take a moment to think through their options. Right now, you have options. Good options that don't involve anyone getting hurt." The purse snatcher was clearly struggling with his decision, his drug-addled mind trying to process Marcus's words while also dealing with the stress of his situation. The sound of police sirens was growing louder, adding to his panic and making rational thought increasingly difficult. "The police are going to be here soon," Marcus acknowledged, taking another small step forward. "But right now, you haven't seriously hurt anyone. That old lady outside is going to be okay, and if you let Sarah go now, this whole situation can end without anyone else getting injured." The robber's grip on Sarah loosened slightly as he considered Marcus's words, but his knife hand remained steady against her throat. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I can't go back to prison. I can't do that again." Marcus nodded with genuine understanding. "I get it. Prison is a hard place, and nobody wants to go back. But taking a hostage isn't going to keep you out of prison. It's only going to make your sentence longer and put you in a much more dangerous position." The veteran was now close enough to act if an opportunity presented itself, but he also understood that any sudden movement could result in Sarah's death. The situation required patience, careful judgment, and split-second timing that could mean the difference between life and death for an innocent young woman. What happened next would test not only Marcus's courage and tactical skills, but also the true character of everyone else in that cafe, especially the man who had spent the morning attacking everything Marcus represented. The tension in the cafe was suffocating as Marcus continued his careful approach toward the increasingly unstable robber and his terrified hostage. The sound of police sirens was getting closer, and everyone in the building could sense that the situation was rapidly approaching a critical moment where someone's life could be lost in an instant. Sarah's eyes remained locked on Marcus's face, drawing strength from his calm presence, even as the knife blade pressed against her throat. She could feel the robber's hand shaking against her shoulder, and she knew that his growing desperation made him increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. "Listen to me," Marcus said softly, now only about 6 feet away from the armed man. I know you're scared, and I know you feel trapped, but you still have a choice here. You can let Sarah go and walk out that back door right now. The police are focused on the front of the building. You might actually make it. The robber's eyes darted between Marcus and the rear exit, clearly tempted by the possibility of escape, but suspicious of what might be a trap. How do I know you're not lying? How do I know the cops aren't waiting for me back there too? Marcus shrugged slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both honesty and understanding. You don't know, but you also don't know that they are waiting back there. What you do know is that if you hurt Sarah, every police officer in this city is going to be looking for you personally. Right now, you're just another guy who grabbed a purse and ran. But if you hurt an innocent hostage, you become public enemy number one. Behind the counter, David watched the exchange with growing amazement and shame. The man he had spent the morning calling a coward and a fraud was now risking his life to save a stranger, demonstrating exactly the kind of courage and selflessness that David had claimed was nothing more than an act or a publicity stunt. The purse snatcher's grip on Sarah loosened another notch as he considered Marcus's words, but his knife hand remained steady. I just need to get out of here, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. I just need to disappear. I understand, Marcus replied, taking another small step forward. And the best way to do that is to let Sarah go and leave quietly. Every second you keep her, every second this situation continues, you're making it harder for yourself to get away. The robber looked toward the back of the cafe, clearly weighing his options. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually release his hostage and make a run for it. But then something changed in his expression, a hardening of resolve that suggested he had made a decision that would end badly for everyone involved. No, he said suddenly, his grip on Sarah tightening again. No, I think I'm going to keep her. Insurance, you know? The cops won't shoot if I have a hostage. Marcus felt his heart sink as he realized that the situation was about to deteriorate rapidly. The robber's drug-fueled paranoia and desperation were overriding any rational thought, and it was becoming clear that he was not going to be talked down from his increasingly dangerous course of action. That's not how it works, Marcus said urgently, abandoning his earlier calm tone in favor of more direct warnings. The police have negotiators and sharpshooters. Holding a hostage doesn't make you safer. It makes you a bigger target. But the robber was no longer listening to reason. His eyes had taken on a wild, unfocused look that suggested his mental state was deteriorating rapidly. Everyone just stay back, he screamed, pressing the knife more firmly against Sarah's throat. I'm getting out of here, and she's coming with me. That was when Marcus made his move. Using his military training and years of experience in high-stress situations, he lunged forward with surprising speed despite his prosthetic leg. His primary objective was to get between the knife and Sarah's throat, and his secondary objective was to disable the robber before he could hurt anyone. The veteran's sudden movement caught the robber completely off guard, and for a crucial split second, the man's attention was focused entirely on the threat Marcus represented rather than on maintaining control of his hostage. That moment of distraction was exactly what Marcus had been waiting for. He grabbed the robber's knife hand with both of his own hands, using his superior weight and strength to force the weapon away from Sarah's throat. At the same time, he shouted for Sarah to get away, to run toward the back of the cafe where the other customers were taking shelter. The young barista didn't need to be told twice. The moment she felt the robber's grip loosen, she pulled free and ran toward the counter, sobbing with relief and terror as she escaped from her captor's control. But Marcus's heroics came at a cost. The robber, realizing that his hostage was gone and his escape route was blocked, turned his full attention to the veteran who had foiled his plan. The two men struggled for control of the knife, their movements knocking over chairs and tables as they fought desperately for the weapon. Marcus's military training gave him significant advantages in hand-to-hand combat, but his prosthetic leg put him at a serious disadvantage in terms of balance and mobility. The robber, despite being smaller and weaker, was also desperate and high on drugs, which gave him kind of manic strength that was difficult to counter. The struggle continued for what felt like hours, but was actually only seconds, with both men grunting and straining as they fought for the knife. Other customers watched in horror, wanting to help, but afraid of making the situation worse by interfering. It was at that moment that something unexpected happened. David, the same man who had spent the morning mocking veterans and calling Marcus a coward, suddenly emerged from behind the overturned table where he had been hiding and threw himself into the struggle. His intervention was clumsy and uncoordinated, but it provided just enough distraction and additional weight to tip the balance in Marcus's favor. Together, the two men managed to wrestle the knife away from the robber and pin him to the ground just as police officers burst through both the front and back entrances of the cafe. The aftermath was a blur of activity as paramedics checked everyone for injuries. Police officers arrested the robber and took statement from witnesses, and cafe staff tried to restore some semblance of order to the chaos that had engulfed their normally peaceful establishment. Marcus sat in a chair near the windows, his breathing heavy from the physical exertion and adrenaline of the fight. His prosthetic leg had been damaged in the struggle, and he was having trouble putting weight on it, but he had refused the paramedic suggestion that he go to the hospital for evaluation. David approached him slowly, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by a look of profound shame and regret. He stood awkwardly nearby for several minutes before finally finding the courage to speak. "I want to apologize," David said quietly, his voice barely audible over the continuing commotion around them. "Not just for what I said earlier, but for everything. For my ignorance, for my judgment, for the way I've thought about veterans and military service." Marcus looked up at him, his expression unreadable. "You don't need to apologize to me," he said finally. "You need to apologize to yourself for living your life with such a narrow perspective." David nodded, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "What you did just now, the way you put yourself at risk to save that girl, I could never do something like that. I was hiding behind a table while you were fighting an armed man to protect a stranger. You helped me when it mattered," Marcus pointed out. "That took courage, too." The two men sat in silence for a moment, both processing the events of the morning and their own roles in what had transpired. Around them, the cafe was slowly returning to some semblance of normalcy, though the emotional impact of what had occurred would linger for much longer. "I've been thinking about what you said," David continued, "about respect and sacrifice and what it means to serve something larger than yourself. I don't think I've ever done that, not really. I've spent my whole life focused on my own comfort and success, and I've never stopped to consider what I owe to the people who made that possible." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "It's never too late to start thinking about those things. The question is what you're going to do with that understanding now that you have it." Sarah approached them tentatively, still shaken from her ordeal, but wanting to thank the man who had saved her life. "Mr. Thompson," she said softly, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did. You saved my life, and I'll never forget that." Marcus smiled at her, the first genuine smile he had shown all morning. "You don't need to thank me, Sarah. Just take care of yourself, and keep being the kind person you are. That's thanks enough." As the police finished their interviews and began clearing the scene, Marcus prepared to leave the cafe. His damaged prosthetic would require professional attention, and he was looking forward to the quiet of his apartment and some time to process everything that had happened. David followed him toward the exit, still struggling with how to express the profound change in perspective he had experienced. "Marcus," he called out as they reached the door. "I know this might sound strange, but would you be willing to have coffee with me sometime? Not here, obviously, but somewhere else. I'd like to learn more about your experiences if you're willing to share them." Marcus paused at the threshold of the cafe, looking back at the man who had started the day as his antagonist and ended it as something approaching an ally. "I think that could be arranged," he said finally. "But I have one condition." "Anything," David replied immediately. "Next time we have coffee, you're buying. And I wanted to listen to some stories about Tommy Rodriguez and Jake Morrison. I think you should know who they were and what they meant to the people who love them. David nodded solemnly, understanding that he was being offered something precious and rare, the opportunity to truly understand the human cost of the freedoms he had always taken for granted. As Marcus walked out of the cafe and into the bright afternoon sunlight, he reflected on the strange turns his morning had taken. He had come in for a simple cup of coffee and found himself confronting both ignorance and danger, discovering both the worst and the best of human nature in the span of a few hours. The words David had spoken still stung, the suggestion that he should have died in Afghanistan alongside his friends, but they no longer carried the power to wound him deeply. He understood now that such words said far more about the person speaking them than about the person they were directed toward. More importantly, he had been reminded of something he sometimes forgot in his daily struggles with pain and loss, that his survival had purpose, that his life had meaning beyond his own comfort and happiness. In saving Sarah, in standing up to ignorance and hatred, in showing David a different way of understanding service and sacrifice, he had honored the memory of Tommy and Jake in the most meaningful way possible. The cafe behind him would eventually return to normal, serving coffee and pastries to customers who might never know what had transpired there on that Tuesday morning. But for everyone who had witnessed the events of that day, the memory would serve as a reminder that heroism is not about the absence of fear or the presence of perfect circumstances. It is about ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things when the moment demands it, regardless of the personal cost or the probability of success. It is about veterans like Marcus Thompson who carry the weight of loss and sacrifice with quiet dignity, using their experiences to make the world a little bit better for everyone else. And sometimes it is about men like David Hoffman, who find the courage to admit when they're wrong and the wisdom to seek a better understanding of the world around them. In the end, that might be the greatest victory of all,